Welcome to Back Away Slowly, a series that walks with you through mysterious places, ominous folktales, strange creatures, and so on, before taking a deeper look at what these stories can tell us about humankind. Episodes are available in a video format on Patreon. The videos include photos, footage of my own visits to these locations, illustrations, animations, and more. Sources, social links, the shop, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewing discretion is advised. On a particularly boring day of primary school, one of my friends was called to the office. When I asked why she was leaving, she told me that her family was going to Mammoth Cave. Mammoth Cave? As she was packing up, she briefly explained that there was an enormous cave system spanning miles across the state of Kentucky. After living in the Midwest for so long, my child brain had long been resigned to accept that everything nearby was boring. I was therefore shocked and fascinated by such a mysterious-sounding location. When my friend returned from her trip, I immediately pestered her for more information about this cave. Now, this friend is a very relaxed person, even to this day, so her descriptions left much to be desired, at least in the terms of the mysterious. But at that moment, I knew that someday I would go to Mammoth Cave. When I began gathering general research for this series, I noticed that Mammoth Cave National Park began to pop up regularly. Remembering my childhood fascination, I decided to dig a little deeper, and I was not disappointed. The cave itself is a marvel, containing 5 levels of tunnels over 300 miles long, some of those corridors being up to 200 feet tall. All of that, and we still haven't discovered the end of it. Oh, and since 1798, there have been over 150 reports of ghostly phenomena. The witnesses of these events include tourists, geologists, tour guides, park rangers, scientists, and more. All of these reports have led to Mammoth Cave being nicknamed the most haunted natural wonder of the world. So clearly I couldn't wait any longer. I had to go. But I'll get to that later. First, I need to cover prehistory, Native American history, mummies, slavery, mining, tuberculosis, a heartbroken murderer, a cryptid, giants, testimonies from various visitors, and the crazy roller coaster that was the Floyd Collins incident. We've got quite a lot to cover, and I hope you're not claustrophobic, because we're going to descend deeper and deeper into Mammoth Cave National Park. The discovery of Mammoth Cave has a very all-American ring to it. In 1797, frontiersman John Hutchins supposedly wounded a black bear. This bear took shelter in the cave, leading to Hutchins finding the cave. Many sources regard this story as more of a popular myth than fact. Whether it is fact or fiction, you can imagine that this cave certainly had a long history before the settlers stumbled upon it. Paleontologists, ecologists, and other scientists have found many prehistoric artifacts in the cave. All of the animals didn't live in the cave, but far more likely is the theory that storms and floods washed their bones into the cave. The list of prehistoric animal remains reads more like a list of potion ingredients. These include the tusk, ribs, and limbs of a mastodon, the jawbone of a giant short-faced bear, the fibula of a saber-toothed cat, the tooth and skull fragments of prehistoric horses, elk teeth, and tapir teeth. But it wasn't just animal remains in the cave. For as long as mankind has existed, no matter in what era or on what continent, we are a species that have simply had a knack for discovery. The prehistoric people of the late Archaic and early Woodland period thrived in the river valleys of Kentucky, utilizing abundant resources found in the area. By 1200 BCE, prehistoric people used mussel shells that washed up along the banks of the Green River to scrape minerals like gypsum, mirabolite, and epsomite off of the cave walls. These minerals could be used in medicine, agriculture, trade, and ritual activity. Torches made of river cane, woven sandals, gourd bowls, petroglyphs, and pictographs have also been found in the cave. One of the most significant of the minerals mentioned for this episode is gypsum, which has a very versatile history. Gypsum was historically used by ancient Egyptians to make plaster and mortar. It was also utilized in the 18th century Paris to cover the walls of wooden houses, as the moisture content would make the buildings fire-resistant. It was also used as windows before glass by the ancient Greeks. It is currently used as drywall. It's added to gardening soil to make the soil's pH levels less acidic. And most interestingly, it used to be an ingredient in Twinkies, ding-dongs, and ho-hos to make the batter light and fluffy. There are a few theories as to the significance of the cave to the Native Americans of the time. According to one excerpt, Native Americans in the 18th century were wary of the cave. They would hunt in the area, but apparently they never settled there. One quote says, "There was something sinister, something far more ancient than their own civilization." In fact, many sources say that there was spiritual significance to the cave, but with no historical documentation to back up the claim. I'm skeptical of this theory that natives avoided the cave altogether, seeing as multiple bodies have been found in the cave, some being laid to rest with numerous artifacts. I was unable to interview any experts about Native American history in the area during that period, so keep in mind that these are theories from books and reports that I've read. There are a few other theories that have some scientific evidence attached. For example, 12 biological samples were found and the tests detected hormones which proved that all of the samples came from males. This led archaeologist George Crothers to speculate that entering the cave to mine or explore may have been a rite of passage for young males. About 2,200 years ago, Native Americans stopped going to the cave as no other artifacts were found that dated afterwards. Quote, "According to archaeologist Guy Prentice, corn was introduced into what is now the eastern United States about the time that Mammoth Cave was abandoned. Some ancient Native Americans who grew corn believed that caves were entrances to the underworld, where spirits lived. Prentice speculates that this idea may have been introduced along with the new food, discouraging people from going into the cave." This theory sounds reasonably compelling. It has scientific connections and hypotheses mixed with the idea of potential spiritual motivations or beliefs. When I toured the cave, one park ranger told our tour group that he doesn't believe that Native Americans saw the cave as having anything to do with the underworld. Why? Because he viewed the theory as being a trope that he was bored of and had seen in too many movies. I was immediately uncomfortable with this guy dismissing any potential historical evidence of a culture because it bored him. In all honesty, I have no idea which theories are closer to the truth, but I'm unsure how all conversation about spiritual significance can be dismissed when numerous mummies have been found in the cave. These bodies weren't preserved like Egyptian mummies, but they are mummies nonetheless. Though humid, within the cave itself there's little to no water. Because of this, the human remains would dry out in a natural form of preservation. In the 18th century, the cave would be the scene of a major mining operation, which we'll discuss later. Quite a few miners found these mummies. However, when I began to read about the treatment of these remains, I again found the common irreverence that plagues human history. Owner of the cave, Dr. John Croghan, remarked in his writings in 1845, "The removal of those mummies from the place in which they had been found can be viewed as little less than sacrilege. There they had been, perhaps for centuries, and there they ought to have been left." In 1811, a saltpeter business owner named Charles Wilkes heard that an infant mummy had been found in Short Cave, which was 4 miles from Mammoth Cave. Quote, "I hastened to the place, but to my mortification found that, upon it being exposed to the atmosphere, it had fallen into dust, and that its remains, except the skull, with all its clothing, had been thrown into the furnace." In 1813, miners found a small crypt that contained a Native American burial. Contributor to scientific journals Ebenezer Merriam made a thorough description of the artifacts surrounding the body. To save time, I will summarize. The subject was perfectly preserved sitting up, the arms folded with its hands over its chest. The wrists were bound, probably to keep the body in this position. The person was clothed in 2 deer skins, which were decorated with vines and leaves sketched with a white substance. The remains were undamaged except for a wound between 2 ribs near the backbone, as well as an injury near the eyes. By the deceased was a pair of moccasins, a knapsack, and a reticule, which is a small handbag. Within these bags was a head cap, 7 headdresses made of large bird quills, strings of beads, about 20 red fawn hoofs that were strung on a cord as a necklace, the claw of an eagle to be worn as a pendant, a bear jaw pendant, and 2 rattlesnake skins. A ripple of unease ran through the mining crews when the mummy was found. Quote, "Many of the miners, both slave and free, were superstitious, and the presence of the mummy so near to the main mining activities interfered with the production. The solution was simple. The mummy was moved to a side passage already known as the Haunted Chamber, not then being mined for saltpeter." Fawnhoof, as she was dubbed, was purchased in 1816 by Nahum Ward, who included her body in a traveling exhibition of curiosities. She was eventually placed in the care of the Smithsonian Institution. The book noted that as of 1968, multiple inquiries were made to the institution about Fawnhoof. Quote, "Their records are now very meager, but show that they received the mummy in 1876, that sometime later the mummy was dissected, and that the cleaned bones are in the collection of the Division of Physical Anthropology with accession number 4789. They do not have the date when Fawnhoof lost her flesh." In 1856, a guide relayed the following story. Mr. Krogan, the owner of the cave, when exploring a new avenue a few years ago, discovered a young child lying on the ground, apparently asleep. They were cold to the touch, yet he could hardly believe that they weren't alive. He had it removed to the hotel, but imagine his astonishment when visiting the body the next morning to find nothing but dust. It had probably been entombed for years, and undoubtedly such an extreme shift in temperature and air quality had simply been too much, and the body disintegrated. There are a few pieces of evidence to tell us that native peoples were definitely mining gypsum in the cave. This includes chip marks on the walls, reed torches, and a few lost moccasins, all of which broadly reveal the routes that they took, though this source also noted that there were more artifacts, but that many late visitors took these as souvenirs. On June 7, 1935, veteran guides Lyman Cutliff and Grover Campbell climbed up onto a rock ledge in an attempt to discover more passages. Instead, they found a mummy that had been crushed under a boulder. Lying face down, investigators determined that he had been chipping away near the base of the boulder, which had slipped. He threw his arm up to try to protect himself, but the arm was crushed and broken. While his legs were free, his arm was pinned, the boulder pressing against his head. Suffocation came soon after. He had with him a woven fiber bag and sandals. Crude, dull, limestone picking hammers were also found nearby, supporting the theory that this man had been mining gypsum. Later analysis would determine the man to have been about 45 years old, and that he had lived about 23,000 years ago. Through the course of the discovery and studies, the mummy was nicknamed Lost John. What's crazy is that this discovery, being made in 1935, meant that tourists, cave guides, and others had walked about 20 feet beneath this ledge, not suspecting or seeing anything, for over 90 years. Cutliff and Campbell were aware of the history of mistreatment of human remains in the cave, so they knew that if word got out of their discovery, that a circus would descend upon the cave. They informed only one other person, who then left to get the proper authorities, and the 2 men stayed to guard the body overnight. Now this is where the story gets odd. Both men reported that their time with the mummy seemed to bring out mysterious events. Author Frank Green managed to track down Lyman Cutliff's son, Lewis Cutliff, who recounted what happened to the 2 men that night in the cave. During their vigil, Cutliff and Campbell decided to explore a passage called Blue Spring Branch. They found a small hole in the floor that looked to contain a mysterious powder. Campbell reached in, grabbing a fistful of the stuff. As his hand was still in the hole, 3 loud, deliberate knocks rang through the cave, sounding like someone was slamming 2 rocks together. The men froze, wide-eyed. They were the only 2 in the entire cave, and they were each only armed with a sidearm. They tried to dismiss these rhythmic noises as being nothing consequential, and went back to their study of the hole and the powder. Campbell couldn't bring his fisted hand out of the hole while gripping the dust, so he was forced to release the powder. Cutliff then tried to grab the powder, and the 3 knocks rang out again. Now thoroughly spooked, the men retreated and stayed with the mummy for the remainder of the night. 3 years after this, Grover Campbell died. 3 years after that, Lyman Cutliff lost his job. Tragic events would continue at 3-year intervals. Cutliff couldn't help but notice the odd coincidences. The 3 knocks. The fact that at that location in the cave, the tour route was 3 miles in, and that route took about 3 hours to reach. Despite the best efforts of Cutliff Sr. and his son, they were never able to find that hole again. Author Frank Green asked Lewis Cutliff, quote, "Lewis, if you ever found the hole, would you put your hand down there?" Lewis looked at me and seriously said, "Frank Henry, would you put your hand down there?" We just looked at each other and I said no. No, I wouldn't. After years of Mammoth Cave displaying these Native American mummies as a tourist attraction, it should be noted that the National Park website reads, quote, "Today the park has consulted with tribal partners so that the deceased have a safe and secure resting place in locations away from cave tours." There is another, even more notable substance found in Mammoth Cave: saltpeter. Saltpeter is a key ingredient in black gunpowder, which is resistant to moisture, therefore making it more reliable. When these deposits were discovered, the cave quickly attracted the attention of colonial settlers. The demand for gunpowder during the War of 1812 would utilize at least 70 slaves at a time to mine the saltpeter, which frequently led to the workers' deaths. Working conditions were, predictably, very poor. The enslaved workers would enter the cave before sunrise, only leaving after night fell. Oil lanterns and bonfires guaranteed that the cave was constantly filled with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Who knows how many accidents occurred to these workers and were either hidden or deemed not significant enough to record. The cave also hadn't been thoroughly explored or documented. For example, off of a passage called Big Bat Avenue lay a smaller passage suitably named Little Bat Avenue. A deposit of dark dirt was discovered there. However, the more dirt that they removed, the stronger a current blew from the other side. The men nervously began to call this crevice pit. Word was passed around that everyone should be careful not to get too close to the edge because whenever they threw a rock into the pit, they wouldn't hear it hit the bottom. Quote, "They talked with others about what could be found or what kinds of creatures could exist in the emptiness past the crevice pit." Another incident that greatly unsettled everyone occurred in 1812 or 1813. Cave owner Wilkins was determined to find out what was at the bottom of Crevice Pit. Using a 45-foot-long rope, he lowered a lamp into the pit. Well, the rope caught fire, and the lamp fell into the abyss. Undoubtedly a little embarrassed, Wilkins offered $2 to any miner who would descend into the pit and retrieve the lamp. A man named Little Dave accepted the offer. Torch in hand, he descended via the 45-foot rope. Why they didn't conclude that they would need a longer rope, I have no idea. When Little Dave was pulled back up, he was pale and shaking, finally being able to stutter that no amount of money could tempt him to try to retrieve the lamp again. But Little Dave had not seen a hideous array of beasts in the pit. Instead, he had found himself dangling in black space, swinging 240 feet above the ground of what we now know as the Mammoth Dome. It's a little funny to consider the mystery that must have briefly arisen when the Mammoth Dome itself was discovered. Quote, "The ones that discovered Mammoth Dome, the vastness of the dome, must have caused them to wonder about the old lamps on the floor of the dome and how, where, and who had lost their lamp some years earlier." A metal staircase called the Tower would be built in 1953 to reach near the top of the dome. Despite these odd discoveries, slaves would continue to toil in the cave. The National Park website notes that, by mining for the purpose of gunpowder for the War of 1812, quote, "These men were working towards the goal of preserving American independence and freedom, a freedom that they themselves did not enjoy." In 1838, attorney Franklin Gorin of Glasgow, Kentucky, purchased the property. He improved the quality of the roads, but he also decided to hire 16-year-old slave Stephen Bishop to act as a tour guide. It was a logical decision, as who would know the caves better? Bishop became obsessed, badgering those who had worked in the cave for years in the pursuit of stories and knowledge. He discovered the cave's water system of over 20 miles, finding the albino fish that lived there. In October of 1838, Stephen Bishop and Hiram Stevenson became the first to cross the widely feared bottomless pit, opening up dozens of miles of passageways to explore. The discovery of the Mammoth Dome and the ruins of Karnak were credited to Bishop. Most significantly, he was the first man to explore and map the cave. Newspapers began to write about Bishop's discoveries. Soon, when more tourists arrived, they asked specifically for Bishop to act as their guide. Eager to capitalize on this success, Gorin hired more slaves as tour guides. Of Stephen Bishop, cave owner Gorin remarked, quote, "A self-educated man. He had a fine genius, a great of wit and humor, some little knowledge of Latin and Greek, and much knowledge of geology. But his great talent was his knowledge of man. His talents were of the first order. He was trustworthy and reliable. He was companionable. He was a hero, and he could be a clown. He knew a gentleman or lady as if by instinct. He learned whatever he wished to learn without trouble or labor, and professors of geology spoke highly of his knowledge in the Department of Science." In 1842, Bishop visited the Croghan Estate in Louisville, Kentucky. While he was there, he drew a map of the cave from memory, which was later published in the book Rambles in the Mammoth Cave during the year 1844. In 1843, Bishop and his wife Charlotte had a son named Thomas. 1856, Bishop finally obtains his freedom, but he chooses to stay as a paid guide. With those earnings, he's able to move his family to a 75-acre tract of land near the cave property. According to Haunted Kentucky, Ghosts and Strange Phenomena of the Bluegrass State by Alan Brown, Bishop hoped to buy his wife's freedom and travel to Liberia someday, but it was not to be. At the tragically young age of 35, Bishop passed away in 1857 from unknown causes. Bishop was buried in the guide's cemetery near the cave entrance, though it would take decades for a James R. Mellon from Pittsburgh to give him a headstone. Unfortunately, not all guides obtained the few freedoms that Bishop enjoyed. Some had a fate much closer to the typical experiences of slaves at that time. An example of this was the life of Matt Bransford, born in 1815 to an enslaved woman and her master, Thomas Bransford. Matt would eventually join the cave guides, giving tours to white visitors. When Matt's father died in 1849, Matt's half-brother, Thomas Bransford Jr., then owned Matt, but Thomas Bransford Jr. continued to lease Matt to Mammoth Cave to remain as a guide. I'm unsure if Matt wished to continue as a guide and his half-brother supported that, or if it was just the most lucrative option for Thomas Bransford Jr. Matt married an enslaved woman named Parthena, who lived on a farm 2 miles from the cave. He built his family a home, and soon became a very productive member of the community. All of this positive progress just made the next event all of the more heartbreaking. The children of Matt and Parthena were considered the property of Parthena's enslaver. This enslaver sold 3 of their 4 children. In the early 1860s, Matt guided abolitionist John Fowler Rustling through the cave. I have no idea how the topic came up, but when Rustling heard of Matt's children being sold, his response dripped with an emotional cruelty that I simply cannot understand. He said, quote, "I don't suppose you missed these children much. You colored people never do, they say." Matt would act as a guide for the rest of his life, even after the emancipation. At the age of 70, he was still giving tours. Knowing some of Matt's history involving his children made a quote of his far more harrowing. When asked about the cave, he said, quote, "It seems most like a child now, you know. We've been together so long." One interesting development of Matt's story is that, though he didn't know it, he would be the first of 5 generations to act as guides of Mammoth Cave. Mammoth Cave would prosper under Croghan's leadership, the Mammoth Cave Hotel being constructed from the labor of enslaved guides. However, it wasn't just the guides who were overlooked, as the Mammoth Cave Hotel was staffed with enslaved men and women who cleaned rooms, changed linens, and prepared meals. Despite this success, the Mammoth Cave Hotel burned down in 1916. However, the passing of the first generation of guides would not be the last time that these men were encountered. Author Andrea Lankford remarks, quote, "Today, park rangers guide visitors through Mammoth Cave's maze of passageways, and some of them suspect Bishop and the other slave guides return to the cave from time to time, perhaps to check up on how the new guides are doing their jobs." Of ghost sightings at the cave, rangers and visitors note that it's usually their historic clothing that gives them away. One of these such incidents was when a modern-day guide noticed a man in a striped shirt, denim pants, and suspenders hanging at the back of a tour group as the party descended the hill to the historic entrance. Noting the man's out-of-place appearance, she tried to find him after the tour, but he was gone. Tours often initiate a blackout, turning off all of the lights to demonstrate the overwhelming darkness of the cave. In the darkness, there are multiple reports of guides being shoved, grabbed, or touched, but that when the lights turn on, there's no one nearby. On every tour that I went on, they carried out at least one blackout. It honestly wasn't that bad, considering we knew that the darkness was temporary. However, I don't even want to think about getting lost without a light, as, even knowing the lights would turn on, the darkness started to press in within minutes, warping your sense of distance and place. I had considered that maybe those guides had been pushed by fellow guides or visitors who then moved quickly away a significant distance. But after experiencing blackouts multiple times myself and feeling how quickly disorientation set in, it would be a bold move to try that prank and not trip and bash your brains in on a rock. Also, wouldn't that guide have heard someone moving away from them? Naturally, Stephen Bishop is one of the most frequently cited spirits. Supposedly, Bishop had stated that he would not leave the cave, even in death. Quote, "For more than a century, visitors have seen his colorfully dressed spirit in a big, broad-brimmed slouch hat walking around the rooms and passageways. He is even said to have joined tour groups as they made their way through the caves. Bishop has also been blamed for blowing out candles and torches." During a tour, Larry Russell noticed an African-American family standing at the back of the tour group. The father of this family was wearing white pants, a white vest, a dark shift, and a white floppy-rimmed Panama hat, the attire of an early enslaved guide. He was accompanied by a woman and 2 children. After the blackout ended and the lights were turned back on, the family was nowhere to be found, and Russell realized that there was not a single African American in their tour group. On some tours before the blackout, the guides turn off the electric lights and use only a lantern to simulate working conditions of miners and historic guides. The family was again sighted at the back of the tour group in the glow of the lantern, only to vanish after the electric lights were turned back on. Every time the family has been seen, it's noted that the father watches the modern guide speak with single-minded attention. Some of the visitors who have noticed this man, with or without the family, have tried to talk to him, only for him to vanish before they can reach him. This family is most frequently seen in an area called the Methodist Church, as miners once held religious masses there. A ranger who cited the family noted that, back in the family's time, if an enslaved guide and his family attended the service, they had to stand at the back, away from the main white service. None of these accounts have stated if the man was identified as Stephen Bishop from the photographs we have of him, but a few elements of the story do seem to line up. But then again, there are other points that don't. It certainly sounds like it's a guide, but Stephen Bishop only had one son, so the family wouldn't make sense to be his. However, a single guide following the group almost feels like a spirit mirroring his job in the present day. And lastly, there is another sighting of a man dressed in a long-sleeved shirt and slouch hat standing atop Sacrifice Rock, holding a lantern. Whoever the identities of these ghosts are, it seems that the original guides won't be leaving anytime soon. There is one parable, but it seems more like a myth than actual history. According to this story, the first man to explore the cave was a man named Lewis. A rumor started to spread that the cave actually had 2 entrances. If this was true, the other entrance was almost certainly on someone else's property. As well, having another entrance would decrease the profits to be made by eliminating the single entrance's exclusivity. Lewis's owner told him that he would earn his freedom if he found the other entrance. Lewis entered what we in the present day call the historic entrance. The owner and another man stayed at the cave entrance to make sure that Lewis didn't double back. 10 hours later, Lewis came walking up to his owner, saying that he'd found another entrance. The discovered entrance was collapsed and Lewis earned his freedom. But he found that he couldn't bear to leave the cave, so he continued to work there, eventually being buried in the old guide's cemetery. Sound familiar? A new manager heard Lewis's story, and he loved it so much that he decided to dig up Lewis's bones and rebury him at the cave entrance along with a tall, white marble monument as a memorial. Lewis's grave was opened, and his widow was convinced to collect his bones and place them in a new coffin. As the manager wished, the coffin was buried at the entrance with the monument placed over it. One summer evening, a group of 6 left the cave at 9 p.m., discussing old Lewis. In no hurry to leave, they dismissed their guide so that the guide could go back to the hotel and sleep. An hour and a half later, they turned towards the hill to leave, but ahead of them they saw a man in a white shirt and dark trousers with no hat. One of the group walked ahead of the others and called out to the lone man, asking why he hadn't gone ahead back to the hotel. As this group member stepped closer to the man who he believed to be their tour guide, the guide turned to him, revealing himself as a total stranger. A little surprised, the man asked this unknown guide what he wanted, and the stranger disappeared. The rest of the group laughed at the man when he returned with this story, dismissing it entirely, as they believed their friend was either playing a prank on them or it must have been their guide who had merely slipped away from their companion. However, when the group reached the hotel, they found that their guide had been asleep for over an hour. As the story spread, another group decided to go back to the cave entrance in an attempt to replicate the event. They sat at the entrance until 11 p.m., when one of them grabbed the arm of the other, whispering, "Do you see that man?" As he pointed into the woods, they saw the same figure floating towards the group. Another of their party drew a revolver, shouting, "If you do not stop and tell us who you are instantly, I will shoot you. I give you fair warning." At the lack of response, this man shot through a ghost 5 times. When the action subsided, the group couldn't find a body or the figure at all, not at the cave nor in the nearby woods. People soon developed a theory that old Lewis didn't like his new burial site, which made the more superstitious stay away from the cave. Lewis's family asked the manager to return Lewis to his original resting place. The manager didn't want to bow to superstition, but eventually the pressure of the public as well as the family became too much and he agreed. He tore down the monument, broke it into pieces, and moved Lewis back to the cemetery. I find the lack of details in this story suspicious. All we know is that Lewis was supposedly the first explorer, a description usually given to Stephen Bishop. We have no sense of time in this story, especially for the second half. Was this before the arrival of Bishop? There are also no names given to the manager, so we can't place the date that way. I was able to find that one newspaper reported on the event in the late 1800s. However, I could not find any records of an enslaved guide named Lewis, including in a search of the National Park site for Mammoth Cave. In the end, this seems like a fictitious guide who is given the qualities and legacy of Stephen Bishop. And who knows? If there are still sightings of Bishop on the hill leading to the historic entrance, who's to say there weren't sightings of him in that exact same spot over 100 years ago? Maybe this story was created to acknowledge that we shouldn't utilize the remains of an enslaved human being to boost the profits of a tourist site, or to try to own the subject of our fascination. It's a common theme in stories all over the world that the pursuit of selfish ends will stir the ghosts of the past, and to let the dead lie. But knowing what I now know of Mammoth Cave and the tourism surrounding it, that theory is probably wishful thinking on my part. The story is most likely an amalgamation of factual history about Bishop, reported sightings of his ghosts, and fictional drama to draw in more visitors. But it wasn't just guides that frequented the cave. There were the visitors that they were guiding, locals that lived in the area, and a hell of a lot of drama. Is all that drama true, or the results reliable? We'll have to see. In 1858, a woman calling herself Melissa sent a letter to a New York monthly magazine called The Knickerbocker. She wove a tale full of young love, deception, and repentance. The writing of the time is not the most accessible in the present day, so I will quote and paraphrase. Melissa starts by saying, quote, "For 15 long years I have carried a dark secret buried in my heart, until it has worn away my life. But now that I am tottering on the brink of the grave, I am impelled to make a confession, which, tardy as it is, I hope may render more tranquil my last sad hours." From that incredibly dramatic introduction, she goes on to say that she was the only daughter of a Kentucky farmer. She admitted that her parents were quite overindulgent of their only child, so Melissa grew up proud and headstrong. However, she rarely strayed from her town, and her ideas of how life worked were ignorant and crude. She loved her home, particularly Mammoth Cave, as her father's land rested over it. As the entrance wasn't far from her home, she spent her childhood exploring the caverns. In any case, her headstrong disposition chased off many tutors, until Boston-born Mr. William Beverly. As their lessons progressed, she became smitten with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed young man. He was amiable, gentle, and kind. But he did not engage with her obstinate, childish antics, instead encouraging her to be a dutiful student. She even shows him the wonders of the cave's passageways, entrusting him with her own secret escape and sanctuary. One day, Beverly told her that she would have a vacation, as he would be visiting Boston for a month. Confused as to why she was so upset with his departure, Melissa wandered the cave to think, and she realized that she'd come to love her gentle tutor. She encountered Beverly as she emerged from the cave, but he scolded her for being alone in such a dark and oppressive place. Though this comment struck her heart, she didn't dwell on it and bade him goodbye for his trip. Her newfound love for him made her into a far more obedient student when he returned. Though surprised at her sudden show of maturity, he still treated her the same. He was just as kind and patient, but he was clearly not enamored with her. One late summer evening, they walked through the plantation to collect flowers to illustrate for her lesson that day. They reached the Green River, and Beverly asked her to wait while he descended a slick slope to find the flowers they needed. When he returned, she could stand it no longer. She flung her arms around his neck and poured out a confession. When she attempted to kiss him, he detached himself and said, "Miss Melissa, you strangely forget yourself. I do not think that I have given you any reason for this singular conduct." Unable to take no for an answer, she threw herself at his feet, weeping and begging. Instead of the gentle comfort she'd come to expect, he gripped her arms, lifted her to her feet, and brusquely released her. He said, "Have you no pride, as well as no maidenly reserve? Do you not see that I do not love you?" She fled from him, eventually sinking to the ground in a field and falling unconscious. She later learned that Mr. Beverly had returned to her home and, when he found that she hadn't returned there, he alerted her parents that they had been separated on their field trip. She was eventually collected by a few of her family's plantation slaves who had been sent out to look for her. When she was brought back home, she fell into a delirium, believing that her life was falling apart. She was struck with fever and even approached death, but managed to survive. Her parents were not aware of the cause of Melissa's distress, but after such a dangerous event and near-deadly consequences, Melissa's father and Beverly agreed that he would instead tutor a gentleman's son about 10 miles away. When Melissa became distressed at this news, her mother misunderstood her to be concerned for Beverly's employment. She informed Melissa that Beverly's year of tuition was nearly at an end anyway, so it all worked out fine. And besides, Melissa's mother felt a bit distant from her daughter, so she was happy to devote more time to her. She asked Melissa why she'd fallen asleep on wet grass and become sick. Melissa only replied that she'd fainted while looking for the flowers. Melissa slowly recovered into the early summer of the next year. It was then that she learned that Beverly had become engaged to Miss Minnie Haywood, the sister of his current pupil who, quote, "I knew to be a pretty, graceful fool, and nothing more." Melissa went back to the cave, sitting by the Echo River. Thoughts of revenge began to slip into her mind, quote, "I wondered if by any means I could render his existence as wretched as he had made mine. Then I would try to form some plan by which I might humble this haughty man, and make him beg for mercy from me as I had from him." While she sat thinking, she heard voices. Dousing her lamp, she saw about a dozen people enter the cavern, including Mr. Beverly and his fiancée. A cold fury rose within Melissa as she heard how gently he spoke to Minnie, more amorous than he'd ever been with her. The group climbed into a boat, but Beverly was stopped, as he would put them over the limit. Another young man offered to wait with Beverly, but he declined. Melissa knew that the next group wouldn't be for another hour. When the boat was out of sight and out of earshot, Melissa relit her lamp and asked, "How are you, Mr. Beverly?" He jumped a little, but responded, "Quite well, Miss Melissa. I am glad to see you are sufficiently recovered from your recent illness to be in your old haunts once more." Knowing that she could take advantage of her former tutor's discomfort with the cave, she offered to walk him down an alternative route to meet the boat. He accepted her offer, and they walked in silence. There is a parallel path to Echo River. However, there is another nearby path called Purgatory that Melissa knew was used only when the river is too high to allow boats to pass. They had reached a junction of several paths when Beverly dropped his lamp. Melissa reached to help, but then she stopped and walked away a few steps. Melissa asked him, "Do you love Minnie Haywood?" Mr. Beverly looked at her warily, but said firmly, "I love her and intend to marry her." Melissa quickly stepped behind a large rock and extinguished her lamp. Beverly called out, "Melissa, where are you? What are you going to do?" "I am going to leave you." Melissa stayed in the cavern, waiting for him to call out to her, to beg for mercy, to need her. But he didn't. She only heard his footsteps move away from her, fumbling into the darkness, until she couldn't hear him anymore. She stood in the dark until it occurred to her that a guide might ultimately find her there. She threw Mr. Beverly's broken lamp away and fled. Returning home, her mother told her that her father had been called to work in New York, and that her parents felt that change might benefit Melissa. She couldn't focus on this news, as she had abandoned Beverly mere hours ago. Quote, "I felt a savage delight in the fright, the terror, the despair into which I had plunged him. I knew there would be hours of searching before he could be found, and I thought of the tortures he was then enduring with positive delight. But I never dreamt of death. No one to my knowledge has ever been entirely lost in the cave, and I never contemplated the possibility that he would head the list of those who had perished in that awful darkness and silence." As a side note, I have no idea what Melissa thought would happen if Mr. Beverly did beg for mercy and if she would then lead him out, or if Mr. Beverly was found. Neither consequence would have benefited Melissa beyond short-term satisfaction, though that's probably exactly what it was. Short-term emotion seeking out a short-term result. This was an impulse of opportunity, and nothing more. Minnie Haywood's brother arrived at the house, telling Melissa's father that Mr. Beverly was lost in the cave. Melissa's father summoned 4 of his slaves and, torches in hand, they all left to join the search. That night, Melissa was plagued with the idea that Beverly may have fallen into a pit. The next morning, her father returned, but they hadn't found her former tutor. When they found his lantern, there was renewed hope. This hope grew when they found his cap. Quote, "All the neighborhood was round to join the search, and the great cavern was illuminated as it had never been before, with the glare of 100 torches." But no other trace of William Beverly was ever found. The guilt of condemning a man to a horrible death ate away at Melissa, but no matter how many, quote, "tears of blood" she wept, it would not bring him back. She could not bear to return to live in Kentucky, choosing instead to go abroad with friends. The last chapter of this tale of first love gone horribly wrong reads as follows. "Since that time, I have been a constant wanderer in search of health and happiness, always in vain. No other man has ever offered to fill the place of my murdered idol. I have lived alone, sad, an unloved woman. I feel now that my hours on earth are numbered, and that the deadly disease which for years has tormented me is about to claim its prey. Before these few lines shall reach the public eye, I shall have buried myself in a living tomb. I am going to re-enter that dark cave, the threshold of which I have not crossed for 15 years, and there I will patiently await the coming of that death, which I hope to me will be a blessed release. The gloom and horror to which, years ago, I doomed my victim shall be around me when I die, for I think that perhaps from amid the silent rocks which witnessed my crime, my last prayer of forgiveness will find acceptance." Rangers and visitors have heard a woman crying out for someone by the Echo River. One ranger in particular returned from his route by Echo River, reporting a woman crying out, but he hadn't known of Melissa's story until an older guide explained it later. A few of these accounts say that the voice calls out for Mr. Beverly specifically, while others only hear a woman whispering or calling out, a spirit having not found the peace she so desperately desired. There are even reports of an unidentified man in formal mid to late 1800s attire, a black and white suit, a cummerbund, which is described as a thick waist sash, wandering around Chief City. This, of course, is believed to be Mr. Beverly. This story was included in nearly every source that I encountered, recounting, and sometimes slightly changing, some of the details. Many believe that the deadly disease that the author is dying of must be tuberculosis. The problem is that many sources report the tuberculosis diagnosis as fact, as opposed to finding the original article and confirming it for themselves. Of course, this is how many factual stories become fictitious. However, according to Joe Nickel in an article he wrote for the fittingly named Skeptical Inquirer, this isn't a factual story at all. Nickel writes, "Sophisticated readers of the Knickerbocker narrative will recognize the anonymous confession as an obvious work of fiction." The book Lily Devereaux Blake, Retracing a Life Erased by Grace Farrell, reports that the story was written by a woman named Lily Devereaux Blake, who lived from 1833 to 1913 and frequently wrote works of fiction. She and her husband traveled to Mammoth Cave via the lengthy trifecta of train, steamer, and stagecoach, which was quite risky as the stagecoaches were a frequent target of bandits. In fact, Jesse James would rob the Mammoth Cave stagecoach in September of 1880. Farrell also commented that Blake and her husband were most likely guided through the cave by enslaved guide Matt Bransford, who would have been quite knowledgeable in geology and Native American lore. She was so inspired by her visit that she poured some of her own frustrations into the story. Blake herself had lamented, quote, "I was 24 years old, and yet I was told in the cant of the day that my life was over." This is by no means a strictly historical phenomena, the centuries of society dismissing a woman for the crime of aging. Blake then gives Melissa the traits that she herself had, that society so desperately tries to expel from young girls. Qualities such as being proud, headstrong, and self-willed. This character leads a man that may or may not mirror a man in Blake's own life, to danger in an attempt to push him to reveal his own cowardice. This implies that this story also serves as a cautionary tale. I don't get the impression that strong traits are simply bad, so much as a warning to the young to not let your own impulsive desires control you, lest you harm others. Nickel of the Skeptical Inquirer traces retellings that added or changed details. This led to a fascinating effect where an original fiction was warped into an urban legend, which further became viewed as fact. Nichol reports that one of these variants says that Melissa returned to the cave to search for Mr. Beverly, but this never happened in the original. I myself found the original story from a scan of the Knickerbocker, and I confirmed that his findings are true. Melissa never returned to the cave until she was ready to die years later of her mystery disease. Nichol's article concludes with a possible explanation of the ghostly voices. Quote, "The fact is, hearing such expressions is common to being in caverns, as most spelunkers soon learn. Many have played the game of sitting in the dark and listening to water dripping, trickling, and murmuring. In such random background noise, we may perceive the sounds of people talking, whispering, crying, or the like." So there seems to be plenty of evidence that this story never truly happened. I understand how the sounds of water in darkness may trick the human ear or brain, which is constantly looking for familiar patterns in what we see and hear, whether we're actively conscious of this or not. I don't know how to explain the sightings of the man in 1800s dress that many believe is Mr. Beverly, except to say that many tourists visited the cave at that time. Perhaps this ghost is merely a misidentified other, roaming the caves for a way out. This was a long story of fiction turned legend turned fact, but now let's talk about a real horror story. One that still has physical evidence that you can visit today. Let's go back a step. Back to the saltpeter mining operation. A bizarre reputation began to go around, that despite the hard work, the miners and enslaved men possessed some of the best health in the nation, that not one showed even a shadow of illness. Ebenezer Merriam visited the saltpeter mines during the War of 1812 and reported, quote, "During the whole time this cave was wrought in for saltpeter, there was no cause of sickness among the numerous workermen. They all enjoyed excellent and uninterrupted health." In spite of these rumors and claims, the only miner actually mentioned by name was sick. In 1814, Mammoth Cave manager Archibald Miller wrote to a slave owner named John Hendrick to report about a slave that Hendrick had leased to him for mining. Quote, "Your boy Tambo is very sick, and I wish you to come over and see him. I have bled him twice and will give him a sweat today. I have got no medical at present." It is unknown if Tambo survived. Despite the actual truth of the matter, this belief continued for years. A professor in 1832 wrote, "I recommend all broken-hearted lovers and dyspeptic dandies to carry their complaints to the Mammoth Cave, where they will undoubtedly find themselves translated into very buxom and happy persons before they are even aware of it." Basically, a trip to Mammoth Cave can not only cure your depression and lift your heavy soul, but also boost your well-being to a healthy and energetic level. In 1838, Robert Montgomery Bird wrote, quote, "The diggers were a famously healthy set of men. It was a common and humane practice to employ laborers of enfeebled constitutions, who were soon restored to health and strength, though kept at constant labor, and more joyous, merry fellows were never seen. The oxen, of which several were kept day and night in the cave hauling the nitrous earth, were after a month or two of toil in as fine condition for the shambles as if fattened in the stall." When I read these quotes, all that it screams to me is justification for horrible and inhumane working conditions for both animals and men. That last line in particular is a bizarre collection of claims. The fact that Bird writes that it's, quote, "common and humane" to employ ill workers tells me that he knows that it was, in fact, not appropriate or humane at all. Reading between the lines, it says, not only is it humane, but honestly, we're doing them a favor. Constantly working all of these enslaved men and animals actually restores their health. And they're happy, see? Don't feel bad about these living beings never seeing sunlight because they go into the cave before sunup and leave after sundown. They're happy and healthy. These writings were a lazy rationalization for horrible treatment, but it would actually echo much farther than that and have dire repercussions. These repercussions would come from Dr. John Croghan of Louisville, Kentucky. Croghan read these reports of excellent health within Mammoth Cave, so he purchased the cave for $10,000 in 1839, which is about $333,700 today. Krogan noticed that timber and dead animals did not decay within the cave. I can see his logic, that the march of time and death appeared to stop within the cave, at least visually. This, combined with the recounting of almost supernaturally healthy men and animals, led Krogan to have 2 12 by 18-foot cabins and 8 wooden huts constructed in the cave. Why? Well, for tuberculosis patients, of course. 15 tuberculosis patients moved into the structures, desperate for a chance that such a deadly, miserable disease could possibly be cured. This expectation and hope seemed to boost the health of the patients for a while. Soon, cracks began to show in the experiment. The national park's official site reads, quote, "Smoke and ash from lard oil planters and a large fire used to light the cave continuously filled the chambers, while the dampness of the air further degraded damaged lungs. Cedar trees and bushes brought in to lighten the atmosphere quickly withered." While some cooking was completed within the cave, other meals were prepared off-site by enslaved individuals and brought to the cave. A server named Alfred noted, quote, "I used to stand on that rock and blow the horn to call them to dinner. There were 15 of them, and they looked more like a company of skeletons than anything else." Multiple other testimonials reported rapidly declining quality of health. Quote, "Those patients who remained in the cave 3 or 4 months presented a frightening appearance. The face was entirely bloodless, eyes sunken, and the pupils dilated to such a degree that the iris ceased to be visible, so that no matter what the original color of the eye might have been, it soon appeared black." Another said, quote, "They lost every particle of flesh, crept gloomily about, coughing so hollowly as to suggest the sound of the first earth falling upon a coffin lid, and added to the natural dreariness of the vault 100-fold. Everybody saw and knew that they were tottering on the brink of the grave, and yet such was their hope that they could not be persuaded to quit that purgatory. They even imagined they were improving, and insisted that they were stronger, when they could not drag their leaden limbs after them." One element that was unanticipated by me was that tours were still going on and would frequently pass the small consumption colony. Yes, these poor people on the brink of death were frequently gawked at by passing tourists. However, when some of the descriptions of these accounts are read, I don't know how much I can blame people for being shocked, especially if they weren't warned beforehand. A source describes the scene. In the bleak distance, ghostly apparitions would seem to float between the buildings. As one approached these ghosts, they would become more solid and would reveal themselves to be alive, although the ghostly expressions of suffering on their faces showed that the essence of life was draining slowly from their bodies. Sometimes a tour group would be walking through a passage and come across a confused, skeletal, wraith-like figure in a hospital gown. Because of these occasional wanderings, many visitors would hear the echoes of labored coughing in random passages, as well as near the huts. The patients began to die, unable to wait for a miraculous cure any longer. Any who passed was temporarily placed on a slab that came to be known as Corpse Rock, before being moved out of the cave. A heartbreaking account of someone who was present during a patient's final moments reads, "Another patient who went in and remained some weeks was attended by friends and a servant, but, his end approaching, the death scene in that dark and silent abyss became so appalling that they fled in terror, friends and servant, and left the man dying alone. Nothing could induce them to return, and when others went in, the poor man was found dead, with an expression of indescribable horror upon his features." Eventually, all 15 patients either died in the cave or went home and died soon after. Krogan had to admit defeat, closing down operations. Ironically, Dr. Krogan contracted tuberculosis himself and died in 1849. Many rangers and visitors have heard agonized coughing and shuffling footsteps, particularly around the remaining stone huts and Corpse Rock. You can see the tuberculosis huts today. I participated in a tour lit entirely by lanterns, and as we passed by the small, roofless huts, the shadows danced in the lantern light, the darkness waiting to reclaim the structures. I found it hard to accept that this was the last home that some of those patients knew, living in a tomb before their end truly came. Some of the patients who passed away were buried in the Old Guides Cemetery at the top of the ridge. The Old Guides Cemetery was one of the top 3 places I needed to visit on my trip. On the first morning, we walked down to the cave to take photos and look for a trail. All that I knew was that it was described as being near the cave entrance. A few trails split off as we descended the main path, but we found one that climbed along the steep slope of the hill. We climbed up 10 feet, 20 feet, continuing until we were walking along the top of the ridge, watching the first tours march along the bottom towards the cave entrance, though I did not see a ghostly guide walking among them. After dodging a gaggle of turkeys and looking at some signposts, we came upon the small cemetery. It was very quiet as I walked through, noting that there were very few headstones. It's a bitter reminder of men and women, used and then forgotten, with only the minimal dignity of a burial. But they still had not even a stone to remind the world of their contributions. At the back right corner was one of the few locations with headstones and markers of those buried there, one notable headstone being that of Stephen Bishop. A few of the men interred in the plot were guides who loved the cave and the land it was on. Some chose to stay, even if they were given the option to leave. But then there were those, such as the tuberculosis patients, who looked to the cave to be their last hope and salvation. Instead, they only found darkness and isolation. Well, except when they were being gawked at by passing tour groups. Those that were buried here weren't given the option to go home to their families, and without a marker, it's probable that their families couldn't find them. I wouldn't doubt that some of them truly hated this place by the end. However, as I stood there in the early morning mist, filming the rays of sun filtering through the branches, I hoped that maybe they could feel the peace of the area now. The guides are close to their beloved cave, but the tuberculosis patients can sit high above it in the sun, and maybe, hopefully, that's enough. Before we move on to the largest story to take place on the Mammoth Cave land, we'll discuss a collection of random or brief encounters, incidents, and folklore about Mammoth Cave itself. After leaving the main cave, the historic tour goes through Dante's Gateway, located behind a large rock called Giant's Coffin. Behind this is a series of small, narrow steps from the wooden bowl room. These are called the Steps of Time, though that's not just a name. Quote, according to legend, when a person will not age, or in other words, time can be reversed as a person goes down the steps of time in a manner that reverses time. I found a particularly interesting piece of information in the 1845 book Rambles in the Mammoth Cave during the year 1844 by John Croghan. If you enter the main cavern today, beside the leading path are wooden vats that continue for a good portion of the passage. In Croghan's book, he writes, quote, at the place where our lamps were lighted, as to be seen the wooden pipes which conducted the water as it fell from the ceiling to the vats or saltpeter hoppers, and near this spot too are interred the bones of a giant, of such vast size as the skeleton, at least if such portions of it was remain. With regard to this giant, or more properly skeleton, it may be well to state that it was found by the saltpeter workers far within the cave years ago, and was buried by their employer where it now lies, to quiet their superstitious fears. Not, however, before it was bereft of its head by some antiquary. Essentially, a giant skeleton was unearthed deep in the cave and then reburied to avoid potential hauntings or bad luck, but not before someone stole its head. A later quote from the same book talks about the crews finding what seemed to be an old cemetery under the floor of one of their main workrooms. They uncovered more 8 to 9 foot skeletons, their jawbones so large that when a few miners placed the jawbones over their own face, the jawbone almost looked like a horse collar on a normal man. Robert Byrd visited the cave in the 1830s and was told of an inn near the cave where many entered, but few returned. Behind the inn was a pit of unknown depth. The innkeeper would offer to stable a visitor's horse while they went to their rooms. The innkeeper would rush back in to tell the traveler that their horse had stumbled into the cave. When the traveler would hurry outside, the innkeeper would shove them into the pit to their death, while pocketing their money and belongings. Even Bird writes of his own doubt in the story's validity, noting that everyone who told him this story were hearing it second or third hand. To me, it sounds like common scary story themes as well as borrowing the fears associated with the bottomless pit inside of Mammoth Cave. While I'm fairly certain that this story is false, it does make me wonder what is at the bottom of some of those chasms. A section of a few tours is through an area called Fat Man's Misery, which consists of winding passages that are very tight at about waist height. This was a particularly memorable part of my own tour, but it may be even more so after reading of a strange doppelganger incident. Quote, Mammoth Cave guide Sarah Flowers reported seeing the ghost of guide Kathy Prophet. This was not your typical ghost, since Kathy was alive and well. Sarah was in a cave room called Great Relief Hall, waiting for people on the historic tour to pop out of the appropriately named passage, Fat Man's Misery. When she saw her partner Kathy come out of the hole, she knew everyone had arrived, so she turned out the lights in Fat Man's Misery. A couple of minutes later, Kathy stepped out of the dark passageway, flashlight in hand. This was a surprise since several people had thought she was already there. No one else in the group was wearing what resembled a Park Service uniform. One of the most unique repeated sightings is that of the disembodied legs. On the Heritage Trail behind the hotel, multiple people, including a few park rangers, have seen a pair of legs running down the grassy hill, frequently in the mid-afternoon. One account details that one of the pairs of legs was wearing denim pants, while the other set was wearing heavy work boots. Bizarrely, an article in the Indianapolis Examiner reported not legs, but a pair of two denim-clad torsos running side by side down the grassy hill. I honestly have no idea what to make of this, but it is kind of hilarious, especially if you consider that maybe the legs are trying to catch up to the torso or vice versa. Alright, so we've walked through decades of time, witnessing the success, exploration, creativity, and tragedy of Mammoth Cave. But the national park doesn't just have the main cave. Oh no, the area is riddled with caves and sinkholes. Caves that many people fought to claim for themselves. One of these people was a caver named Floyd Collins. But not all would go according to his plan. In fact, almost nothing did. Next time we cover the details of the most famous incident on the land that would become Mammoth Cave National Park. We review the story of Floyd Collins at Sand Cave.